You really think you can start an A-10, old man? The question rolled across the flight line like a challenge, drawing a wave of laughter from the maintenance crew gathered beneath the blazing afternoon sun. Heat shimmered above the concrete ramp at Falcon Ridge Air Base, turning the distant hangars into wavering silhouettes. The smell of jet fuel hung heavy in the air. Tool carts rattled. Hydraulic pumps hissed. Somewhere beyond the runway, a fighter climbed into a cloudless sky, leaving a fading trail of white against the deep blue horizon. But nobody was watching the sky anymore. Every eye was fixed on the old man standing beside a silent A-10 Thunderbolt II. Walter Hayes didn't answer. At 83 years old, he had long since learned that silence was often more powerful than an argument. His weathered hands rested loosely at his sides. His faded olive jacket looked older than some of the airmen standing nearby. Sunlight caught the silver strands of his hair as a warm wind swept across the tarmac. Captain Ethan Brooks folded his arms and smirked. Fresh from a successful inspection cycle and proud of the advanced maintenance systems under his command, he looked every bit the rising officer. His uniform was immaculate. His boots gleamed. Confidence radiated from him like heat from the concrete. "That's what I thought," Brooks said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This bird has shut down every expert we've got. We've run diagnostics for 6 straight hours. Computers say she's healthy. Engines say otherwise. But hey, maybe we've been doing it wrong. Maybe all we needed was somebody who remembers the Cold War." More laughter followed. A few technicians shook their heads while others exchanged amused looks. The aircraft behind Walter remained motionless, its gray fuselage baking under the Texas sun. The A-10 was scheduled to headline a major demonstration flight less than an hour from now. Distinguished visitors were already arriving. Local media crews were setting up cameras near the observation area, and the centerpiece of the entire event sat dead on the ramp. No warning lights. No clear fault codes. No answers. The maintenance teams had exhausted every approved procedure. Every sensor reported normal conditions. Every system appeared operational. Yet each startup attempt ended the same way. Silence. Captain Brooks glanced toward his watch. 45 minutes remained until Colonel Richard Mason arrived for the demonstration. 45 minutes before the base faced public embarrassment. The pressure had transformed irritation into frustration and frustration into arrogance. Walter slowly lifted his eyes toward the aircraft. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't looking at the maintenance screens positioned beside it. He wasn't studying data tablets or digital readouts. He was looking directly at the machine itself. The broad wings. The engine nacelles. The panel lines running along the fuselage. His expression never changed. It was almost as if he were listening to something nobody else could hear. "You know what's funny?" Brooks continued. "The colonel specifically requested this aircraft. If it doesn't fly today, somebody's career is going to have a very bad afternoon." Several nervous chuckles answered him. Then he pointed toward the A-10 and tossed a spare headset onto a nearby toolbox. "Go ahead, Mr. Hayes. Give it a shot. Start the jet. Maybe she'll respond to nostalgia." The crew erupted again. Walter's gaze remained fixed on the aircraft. The laughter echoed across the ramp, but he seemed untouched by it. The old veteran simply stood there beneath the bright American sky, studying the silent warplane while the countdown to disaster continued ticking away. The laughter slowly faded, replaced by the restless tension that only failure could create. Captain Ethan Brooks watched the maintenance crews scatter back toward their stations while the giant aircraft remained exactly where it had been all morning. Silent, motionless, unimpressed by every solution they had thrown at it. The flight line buzzed with activity around the stranded aircraft. Portable generators hummed. Cooling fans rattled. Toolboxes slammed shut and opened again. A technician crouched beneath one wing, while another climbed a maintenance stand carrying a diagnostic tablet. Every few minutes someone announced a new theory, only for it to collapse under another round of testing. 42 minutes remained. The digital countdown displayed inside the operations trailer seemed to haunt everyone on the ramp. Walter Hayes remained beside the aircraft. He had not moved more than a few feet since the joking challenge. His calmness felt strangely out of place among the growing frustration. Most people under that kind of pressure would pace. They would complain. They would offer opinions. Walter did none of those things. He simply observed. The broad nose of the aircraft cast a shrinking shadow across the concrete as the afternoon sun climbed higher. A young staff sergeant wiped sweat from his forehead and approached Captain Brooks carrying a tablet. "We reran the startup sequence," he said. "Everything checks out again." Brooks took the tablet and scanned the screen. Green indicators filled every section. Electrical systems normal. Fuel systems normal. Engine control systems normal. No active faults. No warnings. No explanation. Brooks stared at the display for several seconds before lowering it in disbelief. "Then why is it not starting?" The staff sergeant exhaled slowly. "That is the million-dollar question, sir." Nearby, another team disconnected a sensor package and replaced it with a backup unit. 15 minutes later, the results were exactly the same. The aircraft refused to respond. The growing anxiety spread across the maintenance crews like a storm front. Nobody wanted to be responsible for canceling the demonstration. Nobody wanted to explain to visiting officials why one of the most iconic aircraft in the Air Force inventory could not leave the ground. A few airmen began glancing toward Walter. At first it was curiosity, then something else. The old man seemed far more interested in the aircraft than the diagnostics. While everyone else focused on screens, Walter's attention remained fixed on the machine itself. Airman First Class Noah Reed noticed it too. Noah was 22 years old and only 3 years into service. Unlike many others, he was not laughing anymore. He watched Walter's eyes follow the lines of the fuselage, the rivets, the access panels, the engine nacelles mounted high above the wings. It looked less like inspection and more like recognition, as if he were seeing an old friend after decades apart. Another startup attempt was ordered. Ground crews moved into position. A technician signaled readiness. The sequence began. Everyone waited. For a brief moment, hope flickered across the ramp. Then the sequence stopped. Silence returned. Several crew members lowered their heads in frustration. Captain Brooks muttered something under his breath and kicked at a loose pebble on the concrete. Across the flight line, the distant rumble of arriving vehicles echoed from the main gate. More visitors were arriving. More witnesses. More pressure. Noah looked back toward Walter Hayes. The old veteran had finally moved. Only a few slow steps. Just enough to stand near the left side of the aircraft. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied a section of metal beneath the engine housing. The expression on his face never changed. But for the first time all afternoon, Noah had the uneasy feeling that Walter Hayes might already know something that nobody else did. Walter Hayes bent slightly closer to the engine panel, his hands hovering over the metallic surface as though he could feel the heartbeat of the aircraft beneath his fingertips. Every rivet and seam carried a story only he seemed to hear, a memory of countless sorties and long nights under desert skies. The maintenance crews watched in uneasy silence, their chatter replaced by the faint hum of generators and the distant roar of a jet climbing toward the clouds. Captain Ethan Brooks leaned against the side of the aircraft, arms crossed, tapping his foot impatiently. His confident smirk had faded slightly as he observed Walter, the old veteran, moving deliberately and methodically. "You really think touching it will make a difference?" Brooks muttered under his breath, mostly to himself, though his voice carried to the nearest technicians. Airman First Class Noah Reed stepped closer, curiosity mixed with a creeping sense of apprehension. He had been watching Walter all morning and noticed the calm steadiness in the older man's gaze, how he seemed to anticipate what others could not see. The countdown on the operations trailer ticked down, 35 minutes remaining. The pressure was tangible, a living thing that pressed against every chest on the ramp. Every failed attempt by the maintenance crews increased the tension, the air thick with heat and the metallic scent of jet fuel. Walter did not glance at the countdown. He did not check the diagnostic tablet or the laptops scattered nearby. His eyes remained fixed on the engine intake, the slight irregularities in the paneling, the subtle misalignments unnoticed by anyone else. A bead of sweat traced the edge of Brooks's temple as he watched the veteran silently inspect the aircraft. "This is ridiculous," Brooks said, more to fill the silence than to challenge Walter. "We have trained experts, precise data, and flawless systems. Nothing should be off." Walter adjusted the small, worn leather pouch at his side, a remnant of decades spent under the sun in hangars and on flight lines far from this demonstration ramp. He opened it briefly, fingers brushing against the familiar tools inside. A flash of memory passed through him. Desert winds whipping sand across a downed aircraft, a colleague's hand pointing urgently toward a misaligned throttle linkage, the quiet tension before a critical launch. Walter inhaled slowly, his attention sharpening. Every sound on the ramp, the hiss of hydraulics, the rattling of loose panels, the faint echo of boots on concrete, was cataloged and interpreted. The engines remained silent, stubborn in their dormancy, but he could hear the tiny irregularities, the slight resistance in a valve, the subtle vibration against the metal frame. Noah shifted uneasily, realizing that this was no ordinary inspection. He watched Walter methodically move from one side of the engine to the other, pausing, listening, his hands never hurried, his movements precise. The crew fell into a tense quiet, all eyes now following the old veteran as he seemed to commune with the A-10, reading the language of machinery and memory that had been engraved into him over a lifetime. The sun glared off the polished surfaces, casting long, wavering shadows across the concrete, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire flight line held its breath, waiting for something only Walter Hayes knew how to deliver. Even Captain Brooks, usually so certain of his authority, found himself standing mute, observing the careful, deliberate ritual of expertise, sensing that the solution was neither in the data nor in the laughter, but in the steady, quiet hands and mind of the man beside the aircraft. Captain Ethan Brooks finally pushed himself away from the aircraft and let out a sharp laugh that sounded far more forced than it had an hour earlier. The tension on the flight line had begun to wear through his confidence, but pride refused to let him show it. "You know what amazes me?" he said loudly as several technicians gathered nearby. "We spend millions training specialists, building maintenance programs, and developing diagnostic systems, and somehow everybody is standing around watching a retired crew chief stare at sheet metal." A few uneasy chuckles followed. Nobody seemed quite as eager to laugh anymore. Brooks noticed it immediately and doubled down. "Maybe I should call the museum next. They might have a mechanic from the Korean War available." The remark earned a handful of reluctant smiles. Walter Hayes did not react. He remained focused on the aircraft, studying a section beneath the left engine nacelle. The old veteran's silence only seemed to irritate Brooks further. "You know, Mr. Hayes, aircraft maintenance has changed a little since your day. We use data now. Computers. Technical analysis. We do not just walk around listening for ghosts." The hot wind carried the words across the ramp. Several technicians lowered their eyes. Even those who respected Brooks could feel something uncomfortable settling over the conversation. Walter slowly straightened and looked toward the younger officer. His pale blue eyes showed neither anger nor embarrassment, only patience. "Machines still talk," he said quietly. Most people just stopped listening. The response was so calm that it seemed to catch Brooks off guard. For a second, the captain had no answer. Then his smirk returned. "Right. Maybe the airplane whispered its secrets to you." More laughter followed, thinner than before. Walter simply turned back toward the aircraft. His hand brushed across a faded section of paint near a maintenance panel. The moment his fingers touched the weathered surface, something shifted deep inside his memory. The bright Texas sun seemed to fade beneath another sky. He could almost feel dry desert wind pushing against his face. Heat shimmered above endless sand. The smell of jet fuel mixed with dust filled the air. A much younger Walter stood beside another aircraft many decades earlier, his hands blackened with grease after working through the night. The aircraft had returned from a difficult mission with an engine problem no sensor could identify. Teams of specialists had searched for answers. Manuals had failed. Reports had failed. Yet one small mechanical misalignment hidden beneath an access panel had nearly grounded the aircraft permanently. Walter remembered the exact sound the engine made. Not loud, not obvious, just slightly wrong. The memory lingered for a brief moment before the present returned. The flight line appeared once again beneath the afternoon sun. Walter's gaze narrowed. He stepped closer to the same section he had been studying. Something about it bothered him. Something subtle. Something that did not belong. Across the ramp, Airman First Class Noah Reed watched every movement. A strange feeling settled in his stomach. He had spent the entire day listening to experts explain why the aircraft should work. Walter Hayes was the first person who seemed to understand why it did not. And for the first time, Noah began to wonder whether the old veteran had seen this exact problem before, long before anyone standing on that flight line had ever worn a uniform. The uneasy feeling in Noah Reed's stomach refused to go away. Around him, the flight line continued moving with growing urgency. Technicians hurried between equipment carts. Maintenance supervisors checked schedules that no longer mattered. The countdown had fallen below 30 minutes. Every passing second tightened the pressure hanging over Falcon Ridge Air Base. Yet Walter Hayes appeared completely unaffected by it. The old veteran remained beside the aircraft, studying the same section beneath the left engine housing. Noah noticed something strange. Walter was not looking for damage. He was looking for a pattern, for a memory, for something buried beneath layers of maintenance records and computer diagnostics. The sunlight reflected from the aircraft's weathered paint, and Walter's fingers brushed against a faint marking near the panel edge. The contact stopped him cold. For a moment, the sounds of the modern flight line seemed to disappear. The generators faded. The radio chatter vanished. The hot Texas air dissolved into another heat entirely. Decades earlier, under a pale desert sky halfway across the world, a younger Walter stood on a remote airstrip surrounded by sand and silence. A line of attack aircraft sat baking under the sun while crews scrambled to prepare them for launch. One aircraft had developed an impossible problem. Every gauge showed normal. Every inspection passed. Yet the engines refused to cooperate. Senior mechanics argued over manuals. Engineers reviewed data sheets. Nobody found the answer. Walter remembered walking around that aircraft for nearly an hour while others laughed at his methods. He remembered ignoring the laughter. He remembered listening. Then he noticed a tiny irregularity hidden beneath a maintenance panel. Barely visible. Easy to miss. A small mechanical linkage had shifted out of alignment by less than the width of a coin. It was enough to confuse the entire system while remaining invisible to diagnostic equipment. The memory sharpened. He remembered the exact sound the aircraft made before the fault revealed itself. Not a failure. Not a warning. Just a subtle change in vibration. A machine trying to tell someone it was hurting. The desert memory faded. Walter blinked and returned to the present. The aircraft stood before him once more beneath the bright Texas sun. His eyes focused immediately on the same area. This time he looked closer. Much closer. Nearby, Captain Brooks continued fielding frustrated questions from supervisors. His confidence was beginning to crack. The demonstration schedule was collapsing. Visitors were arriving. Expectations were growing. Solutions were not. Noah watched Walter crouch slightly and run his fingers along the edge of the panel. The old veteran's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was not excitement. It was recognition. The kind a person shows when they finally locate something they have been searching for. Noah felt his pulse quicken. Walter slowly stood and glanced toward the engine intake. Then toward the maintenance panel. Then back again. The pieces were fitting together. Whatever he had found, he had seen it before. And judging by the calm certainty now visible in his eyes, the old veteran was no longer searching for the problem. He had already found it. Walter Hayes crouched slightly, his hands tracing the edges of the misaligned linkage beneath the engine panel. He worked deliberately, as though each movement had been practiced 1,000 times over decades. The wind shifted across the flight line, carrying the scent of hot jet fuel and scorched concrete. Noah Reed watched with growing fascination, realizing that the old man's approach was not guesswork, but instinct honed by years of unseen experience. Captain Brooks could only mutter under his breath, his usual confidence giving way to a rising uncertainty. The old veteran paused briefly, listening. The whine of the generator, the faint hiss of hydraulics, and even the subtle vibration of the aircraft underfoot spoke to him, and he absorbed each sound like a language long forgotten by everyone else. Slowly, methodically, Walter adjusted the tiny linkage, moving it back into perfect alignment. A subtle click echoed softly, almost imperceptible over the ambient noise, but Noah caught it. Walter did not react outwardly. There was no triumphant gesture, no smile. Only calm concentration. Then he stepped back a few feet, glanced briefly at the control panel, and turned a single valve. The entire A-10 seemed to breathe under his hands. Engines hummed faintly. Sensors flickered green. All systems aligned perfectly for the first time all day. The maintenance crews collectively froze, some mouths opening in silent astonishment. Captain Brooks stumbled back, the realization spreading across his face. Walter reached into the worn leather pouch at his side, retrieved a small, aged torque wrench, and adjusted one final bolt with the precision of a master craftsman. Every sound, every vibration, every tiny detail was accounted for, and for a moment the heat of the afternoon seemed to pause. Noah could hardly believe his eyes. The veteran, motionless and calm, had accomplished what no modern diagnostic could. The engines thrummed with life, a gentle growl that steadily increased as systems synchronized. Walter exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on the aircraft, as if confirming that it recognized the hand that had restored it. Captain Brooks swallowed hard, realizing that his challenge had been not just met but exceeded. Around the flight line, a tense hush settled, broken only by the rising purr of the A-10's turbines. The old veteran had not needed approval or fanfare. His work spoke for itself. Noah felt the weight of the moment, understanding that they had witnessed more than a simple technical correction. It was expertise, experience, and intuition melded into a seamless act that left every onlooker in quiet awe. Walter adjusted the panel one last time, closed it carefully, and stepped back fully, allowing the aircraft to hum freely under the bright afternoon sun. The subtle vibrations of the engines echoed across the concrete ramp, carrying the proof of competence that no lecture or warning could replace. Every technician, every officer, every visitor on the line seemed suspended in disbelief, acknowledging silently that the solution had come from the hands and mind of a veteran who had long been underestimated. Noah Reed could feel the anticipation building as the subtle hum of the A-10 grew into a steady vibration under the bright Texas sun. Every airman on the flight line froze, their eyes flicking between the old veteran and the aircraft that had just come alive with an almost imperceptible roar. Captain Ethan Brooks stared, jaw tight, as Walter Hayes calmly stepped back, his hands still, his posture unassuming yet commanding in its quiet authority. Noah could hear his own heartbeat over the whine of the engines, but he was not the only one who felt it. Technicians and officers alike were acutely aware of a presence that demanded attention without a single word. Walter scanned the aircraft one final time, his eyes tracing the contours of the nacelles, the panels, the rivets that held decades of experience together in metal and steel. He reached into the worn leather pouch at his side and produced a small, carefully maintained tool, adjusting a final bolt with precision that spoke of knowledge born of countless missions and endless hours under the unforgiving desert sun of previous decades. The engines rumbled deeper, a powerful yet measured growl, and the vibrations traveled across the concrete ramp, reverberating through every boot on the ground. Captain Brooks attempted a comment, but the words stuck in his throat as recognition of a lesson unspoken sank in. Walter did not look at Brooks. He looked past him, as though surveying the entirety of the flight line, assessing not only the aircraft but the people, the discipline, and the weight of responsibility they carried. Noah noticed the subtle nod Walter gave toward the instruments, a gesture so slight that only someone paying the closest attention would perceive it. The hum of the engines seemed to validate it, aligning every system, confirming every observation Walter had made in silence. Around them, the crew collectively exhaled, tension finally easing as understanding spread without a single additional instruction. The aircraft had been coaxed back to life not by computers, not by protocols, not by manual overrides, but by experience, intuition, and the patient application of knowledge refined over decades. Airman Reed stepped a cautious foot closer, still aware of the energy in the air, the quiet respect that had descended upon the flight line. Walter Hayes simply observed, allowing the engines to settle into a stable rhythm, their sound steady and confident, much like the veteran himself. The sun glinted off the fuselage, highlighting the contours of the aircraft, and in that glint, the younger personnel saw the embodiment of expertise and dedication that had remained unnoticed until now. Even Captain Brooks, whose arrogance had fueled the morning's challenge, could not deny the truth of what he witnessed. The aircraft was no longer a puzzle, no longer a problem to be solved by the inexperienced or impatient. It was a testament to knowledge earned, to vigilance, and to the calm precision of a man who had seen more than most would ever imagine. Noah felt a shiver run down his spine, understanding finally why Walter Hayes had remained so silent, so composed, and why the A-10 now thrummed beneath his quiet command. The entire flight line seemed to acknowledge it collectively, a moment of shared realization, unspoken but profound, as the old veteran stood unmoved, the embodiment of competence and calm in a world that often underestimated the wisdom of experience. The rumble of the A-10's engines had grown into a confident, steady growl that filled the entire flight line, vibrating through the concrete and rattling loose tools on the maintenance carts. Airmen and technicians stopped in their tracks, every eye drawn to the aircraft and the man who had brought it to life. Noah Reed felt a rush of awe as he watched Walter Hayes step back from the panel, his posture calm and measured, yet commanding more attention than any words could. Captain Ethan Brooks, usually brimming with arrogance, now stood frozen, observing in silence as the veteran surveyed the aircraft with an unspoken authority. The sunlight glinted off the weathered fuselage, catching on the rivets and panels that Walter's hands had aligned perfectly. Around them, the tension of the morning seemed to evaporate, replaced by a collective realization that the solution had not come from computers, manuals, or frantic adjustments, but from experience honed over decades. A few junior technicians exchanged glances, a mixture of disbelief and newfound respect on their faces. Airman Reed, standing slightly apart, could feel the weight of what they had just witnessed. Knowledge and intuition, cultivated through years of service and countless missions, had achieved what the most advanced diagnostics had failed to do. Walter Hayes moved slowly to the side of the aircraft, adjusting a valve with precision and care, listening for subtle changes in vibration and sound, confirming that everything was functioning correctly. Captain Brooks finally found his voice, but it was subdued, stripped of the confident edge it had carried all morning. I guess you were right, he admitted quietly, almost to himself. Walter did not respond verbally. He only gave a brief nod toward the engines, a silent acknowledgement that the work was done and the aircraft was ready. The hum of the turbines filled the space between them, steady and powerful, signaling not just mechanical success but the culmination of a lifetime of expertise. Noah noticed Colonel Richard Mason approaching from the operations trailer, his pace brisk, eyes narrowing as he scanned the flight line. He had heard the engines, felt the vibrations, and saw the gathered crew, frozen mid-motion in a tableau of respect and disbelief. The colonel's gaze landed on Walter Hayes, and for the first time that morning, the younger airman sensed the full magnitude of the veteran's presence. Every detail, from the careful alignment of panels to the precision adjustments, had been performed with a mastery that spoke louder than any demonstration or briefing could. The air seemed to hold its breath as Colonel Mason reached the edge of the ramp, his eyes locking on Walter with recognition, understanding the silent story of decades of service and unparalleled skill. The flight line, once a stage for frustration and mockery, was now a testament to the quiet authority and enduring competence of a man who had never needed to prove himself, yet had just proven everything without a word. Captain Brooks shifted uncomfortably, the realization settling over him fully. The aircraft was not simply operational. It had been revived by intuition, experience, and the kind of calm certainty that only comes from a lifetime of mastering what few can even comprehend. Walter Hayes stood straight, surveying the scene, the engines humming like a heartbeat beneath him, and for everyone present, the truth was unmistakable. This was the work of a legend, a veteran whose expertise transcended machines, authority, and the assumptions of those who underestimated him all morning. Colonel Richard Mason stopped a few yards from Walter Hayes and simply stared at him. The engines continued their steady rumble behind them, filling the afternoon air with a sound that only minutes earlier had seemed impossible. Around the flight line, conversations had died completely. Technicians stood motionless beside tool carts. Airmen watched from maintenance stands. Even the visitors arriving for the demonstration seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. Captain Ethan Brooks stepped aside as the colonel approached. For the first time all day, he looked uncertain. Colonel Mason never took his eyes off Walter. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly. Walter turned toward him. "Colonel." A faint smile appeared on Mason's face. Not amusement. Recognition. The kind reserved for someone whose reputation had survived decades. "I was told there was a maintenance issue," Mason said. "Looks like you solved it." Walter glanced toward the aircraft. It just needed somebody to listen. Several nearby technicians exchanged looks. The same words suddenly carried far more weight than they had before. Mason nodded slowly. Then he looked toward the assembled maintenance crews. Do any of you know who this man is? Silence answered him. No one spoke. Noah Reed noticed Captain Brooks lower his eyes. Colonel Mason took another step forward. 30 years ago, he said, his voice carrying across the ramp, when this aircraft platform was facing some of its toughest operational challenges, Walter Hayes became one of the most respected crew chiefs in the Air Force. The silence deepened. Entire squadrons requested him by name. Pilots trusted him with their aircraft because they knew he could hear problems other people missed. He trained generations of maintainers. Many procedures we still use today were refined because of lessons he taught. Several technicians stared openly now. The old man standing beside them suddenly seemed much larger than his quiet appearance suggested. Mason continued. The reason I asked him to visit this base was not for a ceremony, not for publicity. I wanted our younger airmen to meet someone who represents the very best of this profession. Captain Brooks looked as though the concrete might open beneath his boots. Walter remained completely still. No pride, no victory, no sign that he enjoyed the attention. Noah found that remarkable. Most people would have used the moment to prove themselves. Walter never had. The veteran simply stood beside the aircraft while the engines hummed steadily behind him. Colonel Mason extended his hand. Walter accepted it. The gesture was simple. Respect offered. Respect returned. Nothing more. Yet every person on the flight line understood its meaning. The demonstration aircraft sat ready. The crisis was over. But somehow that no longer felt like the most important thing that had happened that afternoon. Noah Reed looked toward Walter one last time as the veteran collected his worn leather pouch and prepared to leave. The sunlight reflected across the flight line. The engines continued their steady rhythm. And in that moment Noah understood something he would remember for the rest of his career. Technology changes. Procedures change. Generations come and go. But true mastery never grows old. Walter Hayes walked away exactly as he had arrived. Quiet, humble, and unnoticed by most of the world. Yet behind him stood an aircraft ready to fly and an entire flight line that would never look at experience the same way again. Some people do not need to prove who they are. Their work already did it for them.